class.
Welcome everybody to Knitting in the Round with us here on this Monday afternoon. We hope you're all caffeinated and awake and ready to learn. Like they said, Darren is your teacher there. He's going to be the one demonstrating and showing us how to do this technique. My name's Claire. I'll be hanging out in the Zoom chat with you. And if you have any questions, please pop them there and I will answer directly or forward them on to Darren. I'll also put the handout in the chat in case you need that again. And now that that's all out of the way, we will finally let Darren take over.
Okay, welcome to class, everybody. Today, we are going to have a very gentle introduction to knitting in the round. I'm going to cover 3 different ways of knitting in the round so that you can make items like hats or socks or maybe gloves or sleeves for a sweater. You can knit them in the round, and that way there are no seams to sew up at the end. So it helps to save that extra step. So if we want to jump right in, let's go ahead and switch the view to the view of my hands, and we will start the demonstrations and start the learning. Okay, so just a little bit about knitting in the round, first of all. The first way I'm going to demonstrate knitting in the round will be knitting on 16-inch circular needles. And if you're ever going to make a hat, and a lot of knitters really do enjoy making hats, it's a very common project, you're going to want to get some size 16-inch circular needles. So once you start using circular needles, you do need to start thinking about 2 different ways of describing the size of the needle. So this needle that I'm using here is a 10.5. So it's a size 10.5, and you're probably already familiar with the sizes of needles. They go from 0 up to 50, like 0, so that's just the normal numbering system. Or maybe you're more familiar with the millimeters. This is a 6.5 millimeter. And that is talking about how thick the needle is. So this needle here is much thicker. This one is an 8 millimeter. So that's one way of looking at the size of a needle. And with circular needles, another thing you need to start looking at is how long is the needle from tip to tip. So from the tip of this needle all the way around to the very tip of the other needle. So circular needles come in many variety of lengths. They come in all the standard sizes, but then they also come in a very large selection of lengths as well. You might see them as small as 8 inches long, and they're very, very, very short and can make a very small circle. And I've seen them up to as long as 60 inches long. And so you could knit like a very large cowl, maybe a big poncho, or you could knit flat on a circular needle and make like a king size afghan. So there are lots and lots of different options when you're working with circular needles. You can knit flat and you can knit circular. So you can do more than one thing with them, which is very helpful and very nice. So why is it important that you know how long the needle is? So for starters, you can put a lot of stitches on here. So I could jam like probably twice as many stitches on this needle that I already have on it. So I could keep casting on and really load this up with a lot of stitches and make a very large circle. So even though my needle is only 16 inches long, I can jam a whole bunch of stitches on here, and I might be able to make a tube or a circle that maybe is up to 40 inches. Like I could really, really do that. But if you want to make a smaller tube, like if say I have 16-inch circular needles and I wanted to make a sock or a baby hat. So a sock or maybe like a glove, they're going to be very much smaller. Maybe like a glove or a sock might only be like 7 or 8 inches around. And the problem is you cannot fit your stitches. So if I'm only going to knit something that's 7 inches around, I might only need like 20 stitches. And I'm not going to be able to stretch 20 stitches all the way around this. You see how it would be stretched out on there, and it would become it would be impossible to knit or make it very, very hard to knit with. So if you're going to make a hat, a size 16-inch is the perfect size, because most people's heads are like 22 inches at the largest, maybe 23 inches. And you can put more stitches on it to make it larger. And then you can knit a proper hat. You would not want to use like a 32-inch needle or a 40-inch needle for a hat. Although I say that, and I'm going to show you a way you can make it happen. You can make it work later on. So that is just a little information about circular needles. Does any of that make any sense, or do you want me to cover it? It'll probably make more sense as we continue going. So any questions so far, Claire, or should I just keep pushing forward?
I think we are good on questions. Just a note, when you sort of bend your head to look down, the sound's getting a little muffled.
Okay, I'll bring my computer closer to me. Hopefully that will resolve that question. All right, is that better? Sound better?
Possibly.
Okay. All right, so usually when you're following a pattern for a hat, it's going to instruct you to cast on like whatever number of stitches you need. For a large hat like this, you may only cast on like 40 or 50 stitches. And now I'm ready to start knitting because I've already done my cast on. It's very helpful if you put a stitch marker on, and then that will remind you, that'll let you know when you knit all the way around, and when you get to that stitch marker, you know you've finished one complete round. Okay, so to start knitting in the round and to join your work, the first thing you want to do is lay your, after you cast on, is to lay your knitting out like this in like a U shape, so you can kind of evaluate what you've done. And it's very, very important that your stitches are all laid out perfectly straight and you don't have any twists in them. So you can see right here, it's not perfectly straight. I do have a twist in it. So you want to take that extra second and just make sure everything is laying out nice and straight. So you can see now my stitches are all laid out flat and there is no twist. And what that's going to do, that'll help ensure that my tube is going to be straight and I will not have a twist in my tube, because if you end up with a twist in your tube, then it's not going to work out for you and make a nice hat. All right, so now that I'm sure that my stitches are not twisted, don't knit with your tail, hold it out of the way. You want to make sure that your working yarn is coming from the right-hand side. So start your work with your working yarn on the right-hand side, and then just however you normally hold your yarn and however you normally knit, you're just going to start following the pattern. And I'm just going to do a knit 2, purl 2 rib just for demonstration purposes. So my working yarn is coming from my right. I'm going to do knit 2. And I'm going to pull this a little more tight than I usually would to kind of close up that gap. Knit 2. Again, I'm going to put just a little, not anything extreme, but just a little more snug than I normally would. And then I'm going to reposition my yarn for purl 2, because I'm working a rib. Base of a hat is frequently knit 2, purl 2 rib. All right, now let's see what happens. So you can see that my work is actually joined. This strand of yarn is going from the end of my round to the beginning, and you can see where my stitch marker is showing that, and that strand of yarn is actually connecting. So my work was successfully joined in the round. So as you continue to work in the round and go all the way around, a couple of things that are different about knitting in the round than knitting flat. So when you're knitting in the round, you're always looking at the right side of your work. So as you're going around and round, you're always looking at the right side of your work. You're never turning your work to look at the wrong side. So think about when you're knitting flat, if you're knitting a scarf, you knit one row and then you turn your work and you work the other side of your work. So you're working on the front and then you're working on the back. But with knitting in the round, you're always looking at the front of your work. Now, this is very important to remember for a couple of reasons. If I want to make stockinette stitch, the stockinette stitch for knitting in the round is knit every stitch on every round. So I will never, ever have to do a purl stitch to create stockinette stitch. So normally when you've knitted items flat to create stockinette stitch, you knit one row and you purl one row because you're looking at the front and then you're looking at the back. But for knitting in the round, you're always looking at the front. So for creating stockinette stitch, you only create knit stitches, always, okay? And it's like upside down world. If you want to do garter stitch, you have to knit one whole round and then purl one whole round. So it's the exact opposite from maybe what you're used to. But you'll get used to it very quickly as you're practicing. Some of the nice things about knitting in the round, because you're only ever looking at the front of your work. So if you want to do projects that are a little bit more complicated, fair isle projects with a design, like a picture in them, if you want to do cables or if you want to do lace, you're always looking at the front of your work. So it makes it a little bit easier to kind of keep track where you are. Sometimes when you turn your work and you're working from the back, sometimes it's hard to tell what you're doing. Like if you've ever made cables and when you turn your work to work on the back side of the cable, sometimes it's hard to see exactly what you're doing. But knitting in the round, you'll always be looking at the front of your work and you'll always be able to see exactly how things are shaping up, okay? Any questions about that? That's a big change then from knitting flat. Any questions?
We've got a question about joining in the round. Mary wants to know if you have any special tricks to help reduce the jog that you get when you join in the round.
You know, there are some special tricks to that. Sometimes I've heard people say if you cast on an extra stitch and then you slip it over, and then as you're knitting, you knit the first one and the last one together, and that kind of reduces the jog. But for the most part, I just join the way I showed you to. I just knit the first 2 stitches a little tighter than normal on each time I pass that join, like the first 2 or 3 rounds. And then if you do have a slight little jog or a little opening, I sew that shut with the tail. It's right there and it's in the perfect position. So when you weave in that end, that tail, you can use that to close up any little jog or little gap you have there. Do you have any special tricks for that, Claire?
Those are pretty much the same things I would do.
Yeah, so usually when you use the tail to sew in your ends, that's usually pretty much all you need to do to close up that gap. Okay, any other questions? I'm just going to go back and redo the join so you can see it one more time. Any questions in the meantime?
Nothing else coming in so far.
Okay, so let me quickly get back to that, and I'll show the join one more time. So what are your favorite things to knit in the round, Claire? What do you like to knit?
I like to knit pretty much everything in the round if I can.
I really do too. So I love knitting in the round. I love to do sweaters in the round. Hats, of course, are great in the round. Okay. So let me show you one more time just to make sure we understand the join. So you do want to lay out your work. It's very important that it's not twisted. Okay, so just take it that extra second and make sure it's not twisted. And then you can go ahead and pop your stitch marker right on there to keep track of where you start and stop your round, where the beginning and the end is. Your working yarn should be coming from your right-hand side. And then just however you knit normally, you enter that stitch, wrap the yarn, and then just follow whatever the pattern is telling you. And then I just pull mine a little tighter than, just slightly tighter, nothing extreme. Double check and make sure it's joined, and then you're good to go. If you don't do it that way, let's say you have your working yarn coming from the left, it's not the end of the world. So my working yarn is coming from my left, and I'm going to knit my first 2 stitches. Let's see what happens. And then you check, I did not join because my working yarn was coming from the left. So if you wanted to knit a flat scarf on circular needles, which it's nicer to travel like on an airplane or a train or something with circular needles because they're short and you can put this in a bag much easier. All you do then is you always make sure your working yarn is starting from the left and you don't join your work. And then you could knit a traditional flat scarf in the way that you're already comfortable with knitting. So with circular needles, you can do both types of knitting. But for knitting in the round, you want to make sure you're joining your work. And you could go all the way around and then join it the next time you came around. So either way is fine, but you will get a much deeper, like little seam there that you'll have to seam up with that tail. Okay. One more thing before we move on to the next step. So make sure your stitches are not twisted. Start knitting with your yarn coming from the right. Like we discussed, double check, make sure you joined it. It is joined right here. You can see the join. Now, after you knit all the way around, you're knitting and you're going all the way around and everything is looking good. Before you pass this stitch marker to start your second round, you do want to stop and you do want to make sure that your stitches are not twisted. So you can see how they could twist in your hand. And because it's only joined with one strand of yarn, it can actually twist. It's almost like a hinge right there, like it's still very movable. So before you start your second round, just give it that one last little double check, make sure they're not twisted, and then you'll start your second round, and then you're locked in place. Once you start your second round, you're either twisted, which is wrong, or not twisted, and you can't really change it at that point. You're kind of locked in place. So when you start that second round, you want to double check, give it one last quick look, make sure your stitches are not twisted. Sometimes it's best if you lay it down like this, and then you can double check really careful, and then you're ready to go. And then once you start that second round, you never have to worry about that again, all right? Any questions about joining in the round or anything we've talked about so far? No?
Belinda had a good tip about avoiding sort of the gap that can occur when you join. They say sometimes they switch the first and last stitches on the opposite needle. So they kind of like crisscross or play leapfrog.
Okay, yeah, I've heard it. It's kind of, yeah, that's also a good one. I've heard people that do that, but I usually just sew it shut with my tail. So, but that's the fun part about knitting though. There's so many different ways of accomplishing all these little tasks. You can always learn something new and share your ideas with your friends. It's really it's one of the best parts about knitting. It's one of my favorite parts, please. Okay, anything else? You ready to move on?
I think we're ready to move on and learn some more.
So most knitters really do love making hats, and hats knitted in the round are great projects. So I'm kind of building this first part of the class on like a demonstration if you are knitting a hat. So you would start your hat off on 16-inch circular needles at the bottom. I've knitted my ribbing, I've knitted the body of my hat, and then at the top of the hat, I started doing decreases, okay? So I'm closing up my hat in the shape of a dome, and I've started my decreases. Now, if we look straight down on it, you can see I'm getting my stitches ready to knit. So here's a good example of, you can see how my stitches are really getting stretched out around this 16-inch circular needle. And it's going to start stretching it so much that it will kind of distort my fabric and make my stitches a little too loose because it's being stretched. But then it also becomes uncomfortable to work on, and it's not going to be very pleasant. So I've knitted it up to this point then to show you what to do next. So the next thing that I would do in a situation like this, now's the time that you will switch to double pointed needles. Now the double pointed needles, they have a point on each end. That's why they're called double pointed. They don't have a stopper on one end. So you do have to be very careful because your stitches could slide off. So you have to be extra careful. And I'm going to show you how to switch to double pointed needles and a little bit on how to work with them. So I had this green marker, this was my beginning, and then these red stitch markers are marking where I'm doing my decreases. So I'm ready to start my next. So I'm just going to let my circular needle drop. I'm not going to use that, and I'm going to knit directly onto my double pointed needle. And maybe you're doing a decrease on this round, or maybe you're not. I would probably switch on a round where I'm not doing a decrease, so that way I don't have to do too many things all at once. I can just worry about switching to my double points without worrying about the decreases as well. Okay, so you just want to put maybe, I'm going to use 3 double pointed needles. So you just want to put about 1/3 of the stitches on. They don't have to be 100% even, but you should try to balance the stitches so that you have roughly the same number on each one. And then you just pick up the next one. I'm going to knit them all onto my double pointed needles, transferring my stitch markers as I go. And I'm going to show you how to start on double pointed needles as well. So you could start the whole hat on double pointed needles, but most people would probably not want to do the whole hat on double points. Most people would want to switch just when they have to at the end, because most people do not love working with double points so much. Okay, so now I've got all of my stitches knitted onto my double pointed needles. I didn't do such a good job of spacing them out, so I'm going to go ahead and slip a few onto this one to just kind of help balance it out a little bit. You want to be careful with the placement of your stitch markers. You want to make sure you have a stitch holding each stitch marker in place, or else they could fall off the end. So you do want to be careful about that. So right here, like this is the end of my round, but I have one extra stitch on the end of my needle holding that stitch marker in place. Okay, so I'm working with 3 double pointed needles that are holding my live stitches. I'm going to be using this 4th one as my working needle, okay? Sometimes you might see people working with 4 double pointed needles holding their live stitches, and then it's going to be in the shape of a square or rectangle. But I don't have a lot of stitches, so I'm just going to use 3, and it kind of falls in the shape of a triangle. And I'm going to use this as my working needle. So you just want to knit basically as normal. The first 2 stitches on each needle, I would recommend pulling just a little bit tighter. Otherwise, you can get a gap. And let me see, I was going to do a decrease right here. Knit 2 together, slip your marker. And so you can see I'm just knitting like normal. The other 2 needles that I'm not using are just resting. They're just hanging out and they're just resting. So you don't have to worry about those so much. Slip your marker. Okay, and now this needle becomes my working needle. I've removed all the stitches from that one, and that one becomes my new working needle. So you turn your work counterclockwise, and then I'm ready to begin. And again, you just start knitting just like you normally do. Pull that first stitch, maybe the second one, just a little more snug than normal, nothing extreme. And then I'm going to do my knit two together, slip my stitch marker, and then finish this needle. Okay, and now this becomes my new working needle. So I turn my work counterclockwise, and I start the next needle. The first two stitches, I'm going to pull just a little tighter. And the way this is working out, my first two stitches are actually going to be my decrease. So I'm just going to pull that a little tighter than I normally would, slip the stitch marker, pull that one just a little more snug, and then finish that row or that needle. So right here, I'm going to do my knit two together, slip my stitch marker, knit the last one, and then let's look at it. And so now you can see that these stitches, this opening on the top of my hat is getting much smaller. And there's no way you could stretch. See how much bigger this 16-inch circle is? There's no way you could stretch all of those stitches around. I mean, you could if you were really trying to force it, but again, you would distort your stitches, you would stretch out your tension, and it would not be very comfortable. I mean, you probably, if you had to make it work, I'm sure you could force it, but it's certainly not ideal. So that's why you need to switch to the double pointed needles, because you're able to knit a much smaller circle. So for something like a glove or a sock or like a baby hat, if you're going to make a teddy bear, maybe the sleeve of a teddy bear would be much smaller than 16 inches. So you would need something like double pointed needles. There's another technique I'm also going to cover called magic loop, and it's another way of knitting a small circle. Okay. Any questions about any of this before we go on? How we doing, Claire?
I think we're doing good. We have had a couple people notice that you are holding your yarn in your left hand. So that's a little bit different for some of them, I think.
Yeah, and that's why I do try to remind people when I say, just knit however you normally knit. So I hold my yarn in my left hand and knit this way, but for people that hold their yarn in their right hand, you just, you just continue to knit exactly the way you normally knit, only you're just trying to learn how to manage the different needles. And if you look at how I'm knitting, I'm only worrying about the needles that I'm working with. The other two needles are just resting. They're just hanging out. And so for beginners, I do recommend using wooden needles for double points because they're a little bit less slippery and they're a little bit more secure. I don't have any with me right now, but you can also buy point protectors, and they're like little rubber stoppers. Sometimes they're shaped like little socks or like little teddy bears or something, and you put them on the ends of your needles, and that acts as a temporary stopper and can help keep your stitches from sliding off. If you have a problem with your stitches slipping off, you can get those stoppers, and that will help manage and control that. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, but you can knit continental, you can knit Portuguese, you can knit British style. However you normally knit is the correct way. I don't usually knit like this, so it's not very pretty. All right, any more questions?
I think we are ready to move on. Just to give you a time check, we're about halfway through.
Okay. All right, so this is starting a hat on 16-inch circulars, how to join, and then how and why you have to switch to double points. And so this is now.
Oh, I was going to chime in, Darren.
Okay, go ahead.
the switch from circulars to double points, you could also do that in the opposite order, because I've seen a couple hat patterns where you start at the top of the hat on double points, and then you could switch to circulars when you have too many stitches to fit on your double points.
Yes, I've made hats like that, and it's a fun way to make a hat. And yeah, you can start at the top, and sometimes you'll cast on like 2 stitches on each one. So you'll start out with like 6 stitches, and then increase like every other round. And then once you get a lot of stitches going, it's nice to switch to 16-inch circulars. Although you could knit the whole hat on double point, but most people would probably rather not. Yeah, good point, Claire. Okay, so if you wanted to start off on double points, say you're making a sock or a baby hat or a sleeve of a sweater, you can cast on however you normally cast on. So I'm going to use the long tail cast on. Okay, so I'm going to do the long tail cast on. And I'm going to cast on 21 stitches. And I'm going to cast all of them on one needle. That's the way I like to do it. 1, 2, 3, 4. What cast on do you like best, Claire?
I typically default to the long tail cast on like you're using there.
How about the cable cast on? Is that a good one for knitting in the round?
I like to use one called the alternating cable cast on if you're starting anything in a 1x1 ribbing pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes a nice edge. It's similar to a tubular cast on, if you've ever heard of that, but I think it's a lot less work.
Okay. All right, so I've got 21 stitches, or cast on whatever your pattern is calling for. And then again, I'm going to divide these onto 3 needles. It is nice if they're fairly balanced. So I did 21 stitches. So I'm going to put 7 on each one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that's a nice way to do it. If you don't have a number of stitches that'll divide into 3, then you just space them out pretty evenly. And if one has a couple extra stitches than the other one, that's fine. And sometimes a certain type of a pattern will tell you maybe to cast on 7 on one, 7 on one, and 20 on the third one. For some reason, they'll have you doing that because the way the pattern is made, it's going to make more sense the way they write it. So just pay attention to what the pattern is telling you, but usually you want them fairly balanced when you're casting on and separating them. Okay, so now I've got mine ready to join. And joining with double points is pretty much the same as joining with the circular. You do want to make sure you want to lay them out in a shape like this. Make sure they're not twisted. So my stitches are not twisted. They're all laying out nicely. And my working yarn is coming from my right-hand side. Don't knit with your tail by mistake. And they're going to end up being in the shape of a triangle because I'm knitting with 3. And so you just enter your stitch, wrap your yarn, and like you could do knits, purls, you can do ribbing, you can do whatever your pattern's calling for. See how I'm pulling it just a little extra tight to close up that gap. And then you just continue knitting. Once you've joined it, pretty much just straightforward. You just knit however the pattern is. I think the first round is always a little more difficult. Once you get through the first round, things seem to start falling in place. What do you think, Claire? Do you have any advice on this?
The first round is always the trickiest because the stitches are, I feel like they aren't really connected to each other yet. So it's very floppy.
Very floppy. Okay. And so I finished all of my stitches. This now becomes my new working needle. Turn everything counterclockwise. So just moving it to the next one. And then for the first, again, the first 2 stitches on each needle You do want to pull it just a little bit more snug, nothing extreme, and that'll help close up that gap and help you reduce any laddering or any loose stitches where the needles are separated. Okay. Are you guys able to see what I'm doing? I know that needle keeps slipping in the way. Okay, so
That's always my problem with double pointed needles.
Yeah.
The needles never stay where I put them.
I don't mind it so much, but I'm trying to demonstrate on camera. I would like people to see. Okay. So it is nice, like you don't want to let your needles like that. You want to kind of space your stitches out so that they're in the middle of your needle. And that way you're less likely to drop your stitches, have them slip off. And so I'm going to knit my last one. I've got my working needle. And again, just pull it a little bit more snug than I normally would, just a little. The first 2 stitches, slightly more snug. And then just knit, purl, whatever you're doing, whatever the pattern calls for. You could do knit 2 together, you could do yarn overs, you could do SSK, whatever's needed for what you're making. Okay, I'm going to knit this last one. And again, knitting in the round, when you get your first round finished, you don't want to just blunder right to the second round without double checking. So you can see here that my stitches are joined. I am joined in the round, but only by, I've kind of stretched that open a little bit, but only by 1 strand. So look what could happen very easily. You know, you could twist, that could become twisted very easily. So you just want to make sure before you go to the second round. I could have had a stitch marker there. I don't always put a stitch marker because the tail kind of alerts me to where my beginning and end is, but it's nice to have a stitch marker to kind of help remember. And then I'm going to move to my second round, pull it tight to close up that gap, and then keep progressing to the second, keep moving forward and knitting in pattern however you're supposed to be doing. Any questions about any of this at all? Does it make sense?
We did have another tip because you had mentioned point protectors for keeping the stitches on the needle.
Mm-hmm.
And we did have someone, Emily said that sometimes she uses rubber bands in a pinch if you don't have enough point protectors or they're not the right size.
Yeah, I think rubber bands would work great. Now look what I did. I wasn't paying attention, I was talking. And I knitted, I didn't use my extra needle. I knitted my stitches. Now I'm just on 2 needles. So that's not going to work very well. So if you ever do that by mistake, all you have to do then is just slip your stitches back on to a 3rd needle. You really do need 3 or 4 stitch needles to make it so that you can go round and round. I know it seems like I'm going in a triangle, but ultimately it is a circle because once I'm finished knitting, it's gonna be a circle. It's not gonna be in the shape of a triangle. So you do need 3 or 4. If you do just have 2, then it makes it almost impossible, or really practically impossible. Okay, any questions?
And this would be the same whether you're using 4 double pointed needles total or 5 double pointed needles, right?
Yeah, if you're using 4 double pointed needles to hold your work and you're knitting with the 5th one, and you end up doing what I did and like knit with, and not knit with your new needle, knit with one of the old ones, you'll end up with then like 3 basically is what we have here, which makes it a little bit easier to correct, I think. But yeah, you could very easily be knitting with 4, and then it would look more like a square or a rectangle. And then you would just keep going from one to the other. Sometimes if you're working on a very large project, you might want to use 4 and knit with the 5th one, because that way you can have less stitches. Like you don't want to like load these clear full of stitches. You want to try to have plenty of space on either end so your stitches don't slip off. Anything else, Claire?
That is it.
Okay. Any questions about double pointed needles? A lot of people are very intimidated by double pointed needles. I really like them. I really like them. Nothing else? I thought there'd be more questions. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask.
I don't know. I guess I'm one of those people that doesn't like double pointed needles all that much.
Most people do not. I think I'm in the minority. All right. So that is knitting on double pointed needles. And the reason you would need to know how to use double pointed needles, again, would be to create a small tube like this. This is a very small tube. This could be the top of a sock. It might be the cuff of a sweater. You can make it, if it were a little bit bigger, you could do a baby hat on this. Babies' heads are maybe like 12 to 16 inches, depending on how big the baby is. Maybe you're gonna make a tiny hat like this size for like a doll or a little teddy bear or something, a little toy. There's so many reasons. The sleeve of a baby sweater might be this small, and you could not do that on a 16-inch circular. So you would need to be able to knit a very small tube, and the double pointed needles are one way of accomplishing that. So I'm going to put these aside if there are no more questions, and we'll move on to the next little trick I'm going to show you. Okay, no more questions?
Not on double pointed needles. We have a couple that I will see if we have time for at the end of class.
Okay. All right. So this next method I'm going to show you is called magic loop. And it serves the same purpose as double pointed needles. So if you ever need to make a small tube, again, like a baby sock or a sleeve or maybe a little toy or something, you can use double pointed needles to make that, or you can use this technique called magic loop. So you really only need to become comfortable with one or the other. Usually people do like magic loop better. So it's a good idea to practice both and see which one you like better. But if you absolutely hate one of them, then you don't have to do it because they really serve the same purpose. So for magic loop, what you need is a knitting needle, a circular needle that's 40 inches long. So usually you do use one that's 40 inches long, and the cable needs to be pretty flexible. So they do make them that are even more flexible than this one, but you don't want it to be super stiff. You want it to be pretty flexible. It's very important to make it easier to use. So at the beginning of class, when I was saying that you needed to have you can't make a circle smaller than the circumference of your needle. So that's another thing about knitting is nothing is an ever absolute statement. Always an exception to every rule. So just kind of know about that starting out. But that's why this is magic though. This is magic loop because it's magic. So we're going to be able to knit a small circumference on this very large needle. Okay. So what you want to do, let me kind of reposition my stitches to show you how I got started. So you cast on your stitches just like normal. So I've got my stitches cast on, how many ever stitches you need. And then you want to hold your needles together with the tips together, and you're going to hold on to the tips. And then you're going to move all of these stitches to the back part of the needle. And you might want to count them and divide them out perfectly even, or you might just want to look at it and be like, that looks pretty even. And then what you're going to do, fold it in half, get it pretty even, kind of separate it out there, and then you're going to pull on this is the magic loop, right, Claire? Is this the magic part of the loop right here? And so you're going to pull this loop out back. If you know any magic words, they might come in handy here. Okay, and then you're going to reposition your stitches, half of them on one needle and half of them on the other needle. Okay. Any questions on how I got here? Do you want to see that again? Or does it make sense? So there's half on one, half on the other. So again, you kind of want to make sure that they're not twisted. You kind of want to make sure they're laying flat. Okay. Now I've got stitches on my back needle. This is the back needle, and this is the front needle. Or this one is on the right, and this one is on the left. So there's a couple different ways of looking at this, depending on how you want to look at it. But what you want to look for is your working yarn. My working yarn is on my back needle. So I want to connect this working yarn here to this side, and that's what's going to join in the round for me. So I want to make sure my first stitch is taking this working yarn and connecting it here, and that's going to join my work in the round. And it's pretty much the exact same thing we've been doing. If you hold them like this, then now this one is on the right side. So I'm going to pull this needle out, and that gives me enough flexible wire so that I can use it to knit with. And I'm going to enter the stitch, my working yarn, wrap it, and then bring it through, and I'm going to knit just like normal, pulling those first two stitches just a little more snug than I normally would. And then I'm going to quickly work across here and show you how to reposition. Okay, did any of that make any sense? As I'm knitting across here, do you have any questions I can answer? No questions?
Dee Dee wants to know that these are, you're sort of using them almost like you would double pointed needles.
Yeah, kind of. It is a similar.
I will say for the magic loop, because this is my favorite technique, I like this better than double pointed needles. You do have to have a needle, I would say probably at least 30 or 32 inches long. We might be able to do it with a shorter circular needle with a very small number of stitches, but really anything smaller than that, there's not enough extra cord to get those little, I think they look like mouse ears sticking out the end.
They do kind of look like mouse ears. Okay, so I finished my first, and after I finish each needle, what I like to do is put everything back in what is called the home position. And if you ever kind of get lost in this and you can't really tell like where you are in it, if you return back to this position, which is the home position, it kind of puts everything kind of back in place for you, okay? All right, so, and then you pull out. So I've knitted that one. My working yarn is here. Pull that out. And then you just keep going. And then when I finish this one, I'll get back to the home position and move on to the next round. And this, you know, sometimes when you're watching other people knit, it might not make as much sense, but once you get it in your hands and start trying it, that's when the real learning will take place, and you'll be surprised how easy it actually is. So, okay, so I finished my row or my needle. It all kind of looks like a big mess, right? So if you return back to the home position, then you can kind of see where you are. Okay, and here's my working yarn, and I'm going to continue working. And then once you get going, this kind of looks like this is what it looks like. Okay, and it actually, you know, it's a very nice way to work. You can, this could be the sleeve of a sweater, maybe it's the top of a sock or something. And then you just keep going. Any questions about Magic Loop, how you do it or why you would do it or anything at all?
I agree with Belinda here that I like Magic Loop, especially for traveling, because if you're using double pointed needles, I'm always afraid that one of them is going to drop out of my stitches and roll down the train and I'll never find it again. But if
Really
you
could
only
happen.
have, if your needles are attached on a cord, then you can't really lose one.
True. That's a very good point. I learned double pointed needles first and I really just felt comfortable with them. And I just really never felt like I needed to learn Magic Loop. And I really didn't learn it for a long time. And basically the only reason I learned Magic Loop was so I could teach it. Does that make sense? Is that kind of a crazy thing? But it is nice to know. I actually used Magic Loop recently because I was making a hat and I didn't have, I couldn't find the right size double point. So I just kind of had to use Magic Loop. So it is a good idea to know both.
Good question from Sharon. Do you still use a marker to mark the beginning and end of your round, or is
Yeah,
it
you
more
really should.
obvious?
Yeah, you really should. Just because these are not real projects, I'm just making samples. You know, it doesn't really matter so much for my purposes today. But again, I really don't always do that because I know right here, that's where my tail is. And so I know that I've finished my row or my round because my tail is right there marking it. But best practice would be, of course, to use a stitch marker.
And for both magic loop and double pointed needles, because if you place a marker on the end of the needle, it's going to fall right off. I like to use, I think, what Darren just put in, the locking stitch marker.
Yeah, and I clipped it to the stitch because of that. Or you could put one right here, just kind of one stitch in, and then just remember that really the end of the row is, or the round is here, but you have to put it here so it doesn't fall off. So you could do either, or just kind of keep track of where your tail is. So if you're you're just doing stockinette stitch in the round like this, I probably wouldn't even worry about it because it doesn't, usually it'll say do stockinette stitch in the round for 10 inches or 6 inches or whatever. And then you just measure it and it doesn't really matter. You know, you can always like double check and make sure when you finally finish, you are at the right place. But if you're doing something where each round is different, like if you're doing like lace or cables or something, then it becomes much more important to know where the exact end is on each round. So, you know, it kind of depends also on the project you're making. So don't you think, Claire? And for
It
stockinette stitching
does, yeah.
around, I probably wouldn't fuss over it too much. Well, here now I'm dropping stitches. That's extra fun. Any other questions on how to do this or how to set it up or anything about it? About 4 minutes left.
We did have a question about joining in the round. Now I'm trying to go back and find it. I think someone had wanted to know the technique for casting on an extra stitch and then knitting the first and the last together.
You know, honestly, I'm going to be honest with you guys. I don't think I've ever done that. I've heard about it and I've seen other people do it. I've never felt the need to do it. I've never had a problem. Do you ever have a problem with that, Claire?
I might have done that once or twice when I was new to knitting in the round. But essentially, like say if your pattern tells you to cast on 80 stitches, you would cast on 81. And then you'll have to do sort of a little finagling. And if you have like a 16-inch circular, the last stitch on your right hand needle with the working yarn, you'll have to slip that back to the left hand needle and then knit the first two stitches together and then
Yeah.
mark the beginning of your round. So I find it a little bit fussier than it needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a bad idea, and I'm not discouraging anyone from doing that, but I've just not done it, so. Oh, I saw a comment that said something about they thought magic loop was pulling. I think you're confusing with magic ring and crochet. There's a technique in crochet called magic ring, where you're crocheting in the round and you do this special magic ring and you pull the tail very tight and it cinches up that circle so that there's not a hole like in the top of your hat. That's magic ring, which is a crochet technique, but this is magic loop, which is a knitting technique where you can knit circles of a small circumference. So they sound kind of the same. They're both magic, but used for different reasons.
I have heard that technique also called magic loop, confusingly enough.
Yeah, well, let's make things as confusing as possible, right? That sounds like more fun.
We had a couple sort of unrelated questions to knitting around. Someone wanted to see how to finish the top of the hat, and we have a request to show how to weave in your ends. We've got about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, so we don't have a lot of time, but for finishing the top of a hat, usually, and again, every pattern could be different. Usually, though, they'll have you continue to make these decreases until you get down like the 6 or 8 or 10 stitches on the top. And then they'll just have you cut your yarn, which I'm not going to cut this yarn because I'm going to reuse this sample another time. And then you thread your yarn onto a large-eyed blunt needle. And then you just take that large-eyed blunt needle and you take it through each one of your live stitches and pull your yarn through. And you can slip your stitches off your needle as you do that because the yarn will be traveling through those stitches, and you go through the last like 8 or 10 stitches, and then you cinch it up really, really tight, and that closes up the top of the hat, and that's how you'll finish it. But that's technically not really what we're doing in this class necessarily, but that's how you would finish it. Does that make sense? You would. We do have a couple of hat classes where we demonstrate that. So you just go through here, and then you pull your yarn through, and then as you're going all the way around, you take them off the needle, and then you just kind of cinch it up super tight. But again, I'm going to use this hat in the next time I teach this class. And then weaving in your ends. Like here, I've got that little gap right there. Put it on your needle. And I would probably look at it from, this side so I can see my knit stitch. And I would just kind of go through here and pick up that knit stitch. And you want to kind of hold it. You don't want to pull it tight or squish it. So just kind of hold it and make that tension nice. And that kind of, massage it out. Don't pull it too tight. And you see how that kind of closes up that gap. And then I would just weave my ends in. If I have ribbing, I like to take it up the ribbing like this. I feel like that becomes very invisible. And then again, I didn't leave a long enough tail because this really is never going to be a finished project, but you would weave it up and then over and then back down, but you wouldn't want to take it clear to the very end. And then you would just snip it off really close. And if you don't have ribbing, see, it looks a little bit, but on this side, you can't even tell. It becomes very, very invisible. Any other questions? I think we're about done. If you do come up with any questions as you're practicing, You can contact me on social media. On Facebook, it's just my name, Darren Morris, just spelled out the way it is. If you're on Instagram, you can send me a direct message on Instagram. It's Mr. Woolly Bear, Mister Woolly Bear. Mr. is all written out. Maybe Claire will put that in the chat. Feel free to send me a direct message either on Facebook or Instagram with any questions you have about knitting in the round, and I will get back to you. I don't get very many questions, so I'm always happy to answer them. And if you do make something with knitting in the round and you post it online, I would love it if you tag me in it so I can see what you're making. It would be always fun to see what people are doing, what they're making. So any other questions?
I'm going to put the handout in the chat one more time in case anybody needs that.
Okay.
And then just let everybody know we are going to be taking a break for the next couple of weeks, but we'll be back in December. And I think our first class in December is needle felting, which is not a knit or crochet technique, but a whole other thing entirely.
Yeah, so that's great for knitters or crocheters, or if you don't know how to knit or crochet, it's perfect too, because it's a complete other skill set. So it's great for anyone, really. Okay. All right, so don't forget to practice. It just takes a lot of practice, and that the more often you have it in your hands working with it, it'll start to become second nature and very natural. So I promise, just practice and let me know if you need any additional help. So thanks for coming to class. Bye.